This is Traceability Inside the podcast. This week, we are discussing the mechanism of data exchange between various entities for the public good. We are talking about the importance, the process, the technology, and the governance of data exchange between organizations when it's needed. Today, I am joined by Farai Mutero, who is a seasoned digital public infrastructure specialist and software engineer with over 15 years of experience, primarily in public health information systems. He began his career with HISP South Africa in 2012, advancing to a senior engineering role where he leads software development teams. Farai has extensive expertise in building integrated data exchange platforms for both profit and non-profit sectors. Hi, Farai. Thanks for joining the podcast.
Hi, Emma. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Awesome. I'm okay. Thanks.
Could you tell us a little bit more about you?
Yeah. So over and above what you mentioned in the bio, at heart, I'm a technologist. Technology has been a part of my life, for the most part of my adulthood. I just knew from the get-go that the rest of my adult years will be spent in technology. So as you rightfully pointed out in your earlier comments, I really started out in the private sector, where I learned the ropes in technology, and maybe one of the biggest organizations that I worked for was MultiChoice, and this is a pay TV organization that is effectively in all 53 countries in Africa, right? So they offer the DSTV service. I learned a lot about cloud infrastructure, about how to build global systems. And in 2012, I then joined HISP South Africa, essentially a nonprofit in the public health space that supports a platform that is used by hospitals, used by public health institutions. And over the years, I have really fallen in love with integration and how to build systems that talk to other systems, right? And within the public health space, I've also got to lead certain integration efforts and really to be at the coalface of how organizations get to a point where they share data and all the modalities that come with that, which I believe we'll unpack as we go. My career has really spanned out from just merely dealing with the technology, or by the way, I'm a software engineer by profession. So in the early days, most of my work was around software engineering. But as I have recently moved more into senior role and into solution architecture, I spend a lot of time dealing with stakeholders and negotiating, how technologies should work and how they should integrate together. So I find that very exciting.
Cool to have you here. So there comes different scenarios where sharing data becomes a need among different government entities for the better and for the great public good. Several examples. We have seen that. We've seen that in the healthcare industries. We've seen that in the mining industries, where two entities or more have to share data, for the better services of the citizens or even the betterment of the sector itself. However, people don't know or aren't aware of the process of data sharing between entities, or the technology to do that, or how to build interoperable systems that can always communicate in that case. So the governance of it isn't yet that clear. The process, the technology isn't that clear. But before we get to that, I know we are going to really discuss and dive deep into those topics. What is the importance of data sharing between entities? Despite the issues of data security or sensitivity, what is the importance of data sharing between entities, between government institutions, according to you?
Thanks for that, Emma. So data sharing is absolutely crucial within entities. But in the area of government and in government entities, There are several levels at which data sharing becomes very important. So at the lowest level, within a government entity, you have several departments, right? So for those departments to fully function, there has to be a level of data sharing. And those departments need to work as a unit so that the government entity functions and performs according to its mandate, right? And then you then have the relations between government entities, right? So here we can look at government agencies, we can look at government ministries, right? And at that level, they have to work together to achieve the aims of the government itself. So there has to be an outward focus to say, in as much as we have a mandate as a government agency or as a government entity, and we have a certain criteria of performance that we live up to, what can we do to ensure that we support other government entities that we work with, so that as a whole, and that's what we mean when we talk about the whole of government, that the whole of government functions efficiently, right? So you need to have those champions that provide that leadership within the government entity and continue to drum that beat to the rest of the organization, especially those that are more focused, that are more inward focused, that are focused on the day-to-day tasks and are not necessarily at the core phase of relating with other government entities. They also need to have that awareness that at some point they're going to need to relate with other government entities. And that for that to happen, data exchange is absolutely crucial. But if you then look at it at the highest level, where the government itself measures itself against the performance criteria that it has, or against the vision that it has set for itself, it also needs to have a way in which it communicates with the rest of the outside world, right? And we know that in certain contexts, you have what are called ratings agencies, right? You also got the donor community, and then you've got international relations, where governments have, or nations are benchmarked against certain indicators. So at that level also, there has to be a level of data exchange. But it really starts at the lowest level up until you get to that level where a minister, for example, stands on the podium and makes certain announcements. And a case in point, we saw that very distinctly during the COVID pandemic, right? Where the whole world was faced with a crisis. And the question at that time was that how different countries performing, how are they performing as far as pandemic response is concerned? Where is the COVID outbreak hitting people, affecting people more than in other nations, right? So reporting was a very, very important theme at that time. And the availability of real-time data was absolutely crucial. So one can get a sense that at different levels, there has to be an element of data sharing and data exchange. And it's really at the heart of how government agencies should perform.
Yeah, so I hear it's needed for better decision making. It's needed for innovation. It's needed for reporting, not only within the country, but also against the international standards, right? But on the, let's say on the technology and governance layer, how does this process work? So let's say two entities are trying to share data, because it can look really, really complex, but on the technology and governance layer, how does this process start and how does it work?
Okay, so there's a process which has got several steps when it comes to data sharing between government entities. So first of all, there has to be a needs analysis, right? Let's say you have two government entities, right, that need to exchange data between each other. So there has to be an initiating party that identifies a need, right? And the need has to be well documented. And also the need has to be supported by policy, right? But is there specific policy that gives that government entity a mandate to collect certain information, right?
Yeah.
And that must be a published policy instrument, which must be publicly available for anyone to peruse and go through, right?
Yeah.
After that, that internal exercise has been completed, then you have the second step of stakeholder engagement, right? So the initiating government entity then needs to reach out to the other government entity to say, hey, we have a need. There's this data that we need from you, for example, and that this is the modalities of how that data should be shared, right? Now, that stakeholder engagement can happen in various forms. One of the common ways in which that happens within government sectors is that a workshop is arranged, right, between those two government entities. It could be a 2 or 3 day workshop where this consultative process takes place. And there is engagement on both ends to really discuss what the need is and how it can be addressed. After that process has been completed, and while we're at that stage, the idea behind that stakeholder engagement is to identify buy-in, right? So you want the buy-in from the other government entity. And within that engagement, the other government entity should address or should identify concerns that they may have, right? And so they should be given an opportunity to ask questions so that they can get clarification, right? And after all those issues are ironed out, then we then have a step whereby the initiating government entity must publish a minimum data set. Right. So this data set identifies at a very low level of detail the type of data that they need, right? Line by line. What is the data that they need, right? If it's a data set that has got, 10 or 15 data items, they must be well documented, right? That we need this and that data, right? That data set is then published. And again, you can have another exercise where that data set is discussed by the two entities.
But that is still on the needs assessment.
Yeah, so we've done the internal needs analysis. Now we're in step 2, where we've done the stakeholder engagement, the initial stakeholder engagement. And now on the third step, we're talking about publishing the data set.
How does the minimum data set looks like? Will it be just data points or?
Exactly. It could be data points. So again, let's use a hypothetical example. I'll use one from the health space where I'm interviewing. So let's say it was we are back in the COVID pandemic, right? And or maybe we can use the mining example, right? Traceability, right? So let's say government needs to know minerals that have been processed, right? By specific players within the industry, right? So let's think of a few data points that would be important in their data collection. Do any come to mind?
Processed minerals or exported minerals.
Right. So exported minerals, maybe it has to be measured in ounces, maybe in tons, right?
Tons.
Exactly. The quality of the minerals that were processed, date and time, right? Each shipment, right? What is the date and time of that shipment took place? And again, you then get down to the details of that industry. Who was this? Who did the sign off, right? What is the agency that did the sign off? What is the agency that did the shipment, right? So you get the idea. So that is the kind of data set we're talking about.
It's a whole semantic, it's a whole ontology of different data points and specification and attributes and formats.
Exactly. Now, at that step, after the data set has been published, it is always good, especially in industries, in sensitive industries where, the data set could be of a sensitive nature, that such a process be accompanied by another engagement, right? An in-person engagement where people sit at the table and go through that data set, right? So hopefully it would have been published ahead of time, and that the different stakeholders are given an opportunity to reflect internally about the contents of it. So by the time they then come to the workshop to to provide feedback, they already have got a good understanding of what the data set contains. There has to be a process whereby questions are then asked. That, okay, why do you need that data? And then it becomes important for the government department to provide clarity, right? Mm-hmm. That they need that data for this and that reason, right? Mm-hmm. In successful government relations around this area, the governments need to prepare what are called indicators, right? So these indicators effectively inform the stakeholders that the data that you're requesting from you help us to achieve this end goal, right? Mm-hmm. That we have a set of reporting that we need to perform, that we need to address, whether internally or externally, maybe to the investor community, right?
Yes.
And it's driven by evidence to say, okay, this is our needs, and that's the reason why we are publishing this data set, right? So that then gives confidence to the industry players that, okay, this is the ultimate goal, this is the ultimate destination where this data is going. And it fosters buy-in by all the stakeholders. After they've got that understanding, it builds rapport between the industry players and the government entity. All right, so after the data set has been published, we then get to step 4, where we then have the signing of data sharing agreements. Right. So that's a very important step, right, where the data sharing agreements are signed, right? And the data sharing agreement must be clear, right? That what is the duty of each player in that agreement, right? What is the frequency through which the data must be shared? Is it monthly? Is it weekly? Is it daily? In what form should that data be shared, right? And to close the loop around that, it's also important to include clauses that have to do with consequence management, right? Now, it might not necessarily be a legal document, right? Because again, here the government is still trying to build rapport with the industry, right? It varies from government department to government department. If there's already a law or a policy in place that has got legal teeth, right, it can be referred to, right, to say this is the policy that is supporting this request, right? So if that policy already includes clauses around consequence management, the stakeholders can read through that. They can help their legal departments, reading through that, so that internally they understand the consequences of not sharing that data after they've signed on the dotted line. And after that data sharing agreement has been signed, that really then starts the process through which we then get to the next stage, where now you then involve technical teams. Right? So, okay, after the decision makers have signed the data sharing agreements, then we then bring in the technical teams to then start the process of the data exchange, right? And there's a whole workflow around how technical teams can handle that process. And it takes time, right? To range from a month to 3 months, after which, the data can start, flowing smoothly. And then usually when the data sharing has started, you then have the launch date of the data sharing pipeline. In some contexts, it's marked with a launch date, right? It's always something good to celebrate, right? Especially if the data is of great importance, right? And then after that launch, you then have the routine monitoring on a monthly basis to see if the data is flowing as expected.
So going back, so if two or three entities are collecting data in different formats, and they have different technologies that they use, how do you ensure, how does that work? How do you ensure that they align on a specific standard and a specific format?
Right. So the gold standard for this is that, so maybe just to unpack the challenges, the technical challenges that we usually see in that kind of situation. you have 3 or 4 entities, or maybe let's look at 2 or 3, right? So each entity might have their own internal software or technology, right? Or platform or database where that data is sitting. And it's in a particular format. It could be coming from vendor A, right? We want, identify those vendors. And partner B could be also having its own platform that is supported by vendor B, right? That's a different vendor. And also the third, organization could be supported by probably vendor A or B or C, right? So all those parties are using different technologies, or they're speaking different languages, if you like, right? Mm-hmm. So the recommendation we suggest in that scenario is that you have some sort of an information mediator layer, right? Mm-hmm. Like a central kind of technology that is agnostic to the different technologies that are being used by each of these players, right? Mm-hmm. And that information mediator solution can then be underpinned by a data exchange standard, right? Mm-hmm. So this data exchange standard identifies how the data will be exchanged in what format, right? And you actually have publications of that standard ahead of time, right? So that the technical teams can then go through it and start adjusting their systems so that the data that is in whatever internal format that they have can then be modified through maybe an adapter, right? So that it can fit into the format that is recommended by that standard.
I see. So how does the information mediator become agnostic? That technology itself, does it convert the data to a specific format? What makes it agnostic?
So what makes it agnostic is that almost in all industries now we have international standards, right? You have international standards that you have industry. So you've got three levels, right? You have industry standards, right? Mm-hmm. What are the existing standards within the industry? What are the big players? What are the standards that the big players are subscribing to? So usually they provide the leadership, and usually have a third party organization that sets the standard, right? So for this kind of industry, we recommend this approach, right? And then you've got big industry players adopting that standard, right? So once they adopt that standard, they become early adopters and early champions of that standard. And usually they set the pace for the rest of the industry, right? So when you then have an information mediator technology in place, it must subscribe to that standard, right? So that's where you have your technology vendors coming in, right? So the technology vendor that comes in must have the ability to implement that standard that is within the industry already, right? So that's one of the qualification criteria that you use to they choose vendor A over vendor B as to whether they can implement an information mediator solution that is based on a given standard.
And it doesn't always have to be international, right? So a specific sector can decide and say, this is our standard. For example, we are the only ones that sells pyrethrum in Rwanda or in other countries, right? And we want to really to grow this sector. So we need to share data of how we're selling and how we are producing so we can agree on a standard. It doesn't have to always be international, right?
It doesn't always have to be international. Now, for the standard to be adopted in an industry, you almost always need to have an independent industry watchdog or entity that supports that standard. So one could use the analogy of a referee, right? To say this referee must be neutral, or that entity must be neutral. And for them, what usually gives credibility to such an entity is them having a non-profit status, right? So they're a non-profit organization that their job is to set the standard, right? And then make that publish that standard to the rest of the industry. So if an industry player wants to participate in a data exchange platform or in a data exchange agreement, they have to consult that entity. So, okay, we want to participate. How does this standard work, right? So to sustain the operations of that entity, usually they offer training services, right? So they offer training services, and in some cases they offer auditing services, right? And, you know, as part of how they sustain their operations as an NPO, but really for the benefit of the industry, of the industry. And their independentness is absolutely crucial so that they have the credibility of the rest of the industry.
So I have a question, and now I know you are from the health sector, but what are some of the tools or platforms that are commonly used to facilitate data sharing within and between organizations? You know, some that you can refer to our listeners today.
Right. Okay, so essentially we have, as far as a data exchange, we have a maturity model, right? So at the lowest level, you have situations whereby data exchange is facilitated primarily through ETL processes, right? So at the very minimum, you have entity A sharing data with entity B through a data dump, right? So that data dump, in most cases, it needs to be uploaded to a central repository, right? Or usually it's the repository that is offered by entity B, right? Or government entity B, right? So usually it could be something as simple as a cloud drive, or you could have something that is more professional, like we now have private cloud providers like Nextcloud. They provide this kind of technologies. And then one could even use other technologies like OneDrive. It can also be used for that purpose. Or you could go for something that's more enterprise focused, like Azure or AWS offerings, right, from public cloud providers. So it's really ETL driven, right? So you upload the data dump to that repository. Entity A does that, and then entity B then pulls that data from that repository, ingests it into their internal system, and then they process the data accordingly. And then as you go higher up the maturity model, you then you can have a peer-to-peer type of data exchange, right? Where in an ideal world, it is driven by an API layer, right? So what then happens is that entity A provides a publication that this is how our API is structured, and if you want to pull or submit data to us, this is the format that you should use, right? Now it's then up to entity B and their technical team to then build the processes that facilitate the data transformation from their internal systems and comply with that format that has been suggested, so that they can facilitate that data exchange, right? So the impetus is really on the other partner that needs to send the data to the other entity, right? But at the highest level, we then have a decentralized architecture, right? You have a decentralized architecture where you have like an information mediator or service bus, if you'd like. And that service bus, in most cases, you have a number of them that are available on the market. You have off-the-shelf type of service bus technologies. In the banking sector, they really use service bus technologies quite a bit. One that comes to mind that is a general one is Kong, for example. And that one can supports different standards. And also within specific industries, we're also seeing other mediator solutions coming up, especially free and open source ones. One that is quite popular within the public health space is called the OpenHIM. That was built by a South African organization called Gembi. Because that's one of the decisions that has to be made, that are you going to go for a proprietary solution, for which a lot of these solutions are the proprietary solutions, right? Or you're going to go for a free and open source technology, right? So that you can use it immediately. However, but if you need support and you need to customize it, you can then contact the author of that technology, and then they can provide customization for the free and open source technology that you're using. So at the highest level of maturity, you have an information mediator layer or service bus that is agnostic to the technologies that are being used or the API structures of each of the players that want to exchange information. And you really decide that what is the standard that each of them has to comply with. And you set that as a standard, and then they start exchanging information between them.
I see. So that is if the government really sets up the foundation architectures for information mediation that is always ready, so that players, when they have a need between entities to share data, then they can consume from that information mediator, right?
100%. So another trend that we see a lot, especially in government environments, is more of a hub and spoke architecture, right? So the government has more of a need of receiving data from the rest of the ecosystem, more than they distribute data to the ecosystem. So if you think about the mining industry, you have like the Rwanda Mining Board, right? For example, that has a need to receive data. They are a central authority, so they are the hub, right? And the mining companies, they are the spokes, right? So think of the structure of your wheel. We have at the central, you've got the hub, and then you've got all the spokes, right? So they need to set up that structure centrally, right? The information mediator platform. Usually it's coupled with the data warehousing, internal data warehousing or data registry solution, so that they can receive all this data from all these industry players, and then they can then feed it into their central warehouse, data warehouse, or data lake platform.
Is there any best practice when entities are coming together to standardize and document? What do you recommend as best practices on the documentation part of the data sharing mechanisms and agreements?
Right. So best practices are at two levels. So first of all, as I alluded to, or as I outlined in that 7-step process of how government entities can share data, you need to have very clear data sharing agreements, right? So those data sharing agreements, they form the basis of how data can be shared between government entities. In some cases, the data sharing agreements actually have an expiry date, right? In some contexts, they have an expiry date. And when that expiry date is reached, it's usually best that government entities be proactive before that expiry date comes into effect, right? So that, a few months before that, they start negotiating the next phase of the agreement. Right? And in that process, they can also work through any technology changes, right? Because technology is an ever-evolving world, right? So maybe they have made changes to their internal systems, and they want the other players to know that the systems have changed and that they need to make the necessary adjustments so that data can continue to flow in the next cycle of that data sharing agreement. So communication is absolutely crucial, right? Communication is at the heart of data sharing. And then between technical teams, the issue of monitoring and evaluation is absolutely crucial, right? So you need to have a certain level of automation, right, where you have dashboards that populate on, depending on the frequency of the data exchange. If the data is being shared on a daily basis, you need to have those dashboards that help you to monitor the timeliness of that data exchange, as well as the completeness, right? That are they giving you all the data according to agreements, or there's some missing data that is not coming through, right? So reporting and evaluation is absolutely crucial. Now, when you have automated data sharing, there is the issue of downtime, right?
Yeah.
There is the issue of downtime, right? How do you manage downtime, right? So that's absolutely important, right? So the burden then falls on the government entity that is managing this data exchange or data sharing agreement, especially at a technical level, right? That what redundancy processes do they have in place? If they need to do maintenance work which will result in downtime, do they have backup processes, right? Do they have like load balancers in place that can route traffic to another available server while the main one has gone down for maintenance, right?
Yeah.
And also, if you have the right technologies in place, you can have message queues, for example, being used, right? Where even if the receiving system is down, the data continues to flow and it's cached by a message queue, right? So that you don't stop the flow of information, right? But the information continues to flow and it's cached up until, let's say, the data warehouse is available after the maintenance work is completed or after the outage has been addressed, right? So a lot of investment needs to be made as far as solution architecture is concerned, so that you have almost zero downtime or very minimal downtime to facilitate ongoing data exchange.
You can't really own or be responsible for the quality of other entities' systems that are in place. So that means the data sharing mechanism should also comes with a cost of ensuring that other systems actually have enough architecture qualities or meet enough architecture qualities to be able to meet the demand of the information metadata in the place, right?
But you also have another recommendation is routine stakeholder engagement at a technical level, right? Now, this could be maybe monthly, could be a bit too much, but maybe quarterly, right? Where the central government entity, holds a forum with the industry players, right? And they discuss issues, right? That these are the technologies we are using. Are there any industry players that are struggling or that need support for them to submit the data according to the requirements, right? So that, but that's within a group setting, right? But there has to be a direct line of communication, one-on-one between government entities, right? So if there's a particular organization that is struggling to send the data as required, there has to be line of communication, bi-directional, with that organization to figure out that what are the challenges they're having. Do they need support, right? Should a developer be sent to support them and help them with the data exchange or data sharing efforts, right? So it's really two levels. There's one-to-one support that can be provided. Then there's forums and workshops that can be put together just to support that community and even share lessons learned, right? And even make available some free technologies and skills which can then be used to further develop the industry to share data more efficiently.
Maybe adding on that, I think if the data standards that are created are also accessible by the people, by the players in the industry, in clear versioning style as well, so we know, so they can always, let's say after every quarter, they can always update, and know what is changing and what is growing, what is evolving, so that the standard can always grow with the sector itself, right? And it has to be clear, it has to be open to them, and it has to be accessible by the industry players, which brings me to my topic around the governance, the continuous governance of data sharing. So what are some of the strategies to ensure that the governance of data sharing is still ongoing and is still clear and is still consistent and still has quality? If you can also touch some of the clear roles and responsibilities in data sharing governance, that would really help.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, from a central government, in each government department, you have a monitoring and evaluation team, right? You have a monitoring and evaluation team that is responsible for, on an ongoing basis, monitoring certain indicators, right? And data sharing could be one of those indicators. Right?
Yeah.
How are they performing as far as a data sharing is concerned, right? We spoke about the data pipelines from the lowest level up into the government level. Once we have data that is flowing more into the outliers, right, and that is really not following long known trends, right? That simply means that there's something that is going wrong somewhere, right? So from a governance perspective, now has to be an investigative process to figure out that why is this data outside of the standards or outside of the norm, right? Why are we getting much less data than expected, right? So that responsibility falls squarely within the monitoring and evaluation teams, right?
Yes.
And it's then important for them to then reach out after they've done a root cause analysis, right? Because first of all, that root cause analysis has to take place first. After they've identified the root cause, they have to then reach out to the responsible persons or responsible authorities or organizations that are responsible for that gap to really figure out that what was the case, what happened, right? So within a mining situation, you can imagine a situation whereby it is known that at a particular mine, they usually process X amounts of tons of a specific mineral, right? Maybe it's a few thousand. And then suddenly they only report 200 or something much lower than expected. Now the question is, what happened? So in an ideal world, you want to have dashboards that have got alert type of mechanisms, right? That can immediately alert you when those kind of outliers are detected, right? So that you can respond immediately to those kind of issues, right? So that's the one dimension, and then there's the issue of on a monthly basis monitoring the completeness of the data, right? One of the disciplines that has really been established very well within at least the health industry is that there are certain guidelines that are known and published to everyone, right? That data must be signed off at a specific day of the month, right? So data must be signed off to say, okay, this is what we're reporting for this month, right? And we are signing it off, we are saying we are done, right? Now that has got specific consequences, right? Because it then kickstarts a process whereby that data then moves to the next level, right? It's then, transferred to the national data set for that data, right? And that is the data that is then also made available to the Auditor General, right? In situations where there's audit mechanisms. So if there is sign-off of incorrect data, it has consequences, right? And you signed off on this data, fully knowing that it was not the correct data, right? How can that be addressed? What happened, right? So you can then have an investigative process, right? Where that kicks in to figure out that how was it possible that sign-off was granted on incorrect data. So that then helps the rest of the industry to be very, very responsible with the sign-off data. And really do their own internal processes to ensure that before they sign off, they have done the necessary internal checks to ensure that the data is of the highest quality before it can be sent off to the other government entity that receives that data.
Do they have something like scorecards?
Right. Yes. So scorecards are very, very important. Right. Now, scorecards in their best form must be made available to the organization that is sharing that data, right? So that they can do their own self-assessment and self-evaluation against the data that they've shared, right? And scorecards at best should be updated routinely, right? Either on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, so that if government entity A shares data and that data has been signed off and the scorecard has been updated, they are then able to see how they performed against the benchmarks, right? And they're able to score themselves. And that scorecard is then used as a basis of discussing potential data sharing issues, right? Because if they score negatively, then there has to be an engagement to figure out that why is the scorecard, reflecting bad outcomes. And that scorecard can then be used as a basis to discuss interventions that can be used to improve the data sharing.
Nice. That's really cool. That's really cool to learn from the healthcare sector. All right. So as we are trying to conclude this discussion, I want our listeners to know that data sharing mechanisms in the country, it doesn't mean another platform, right? It doesn't mean another software. What does it mean to them?
So Amy, I'll answer your question by saying yes and no, right? Mm-hmm. We spoke earlier about the maturity model, right? And the best takeaway for our listeners to know is that you need to start where you are, right? Mm-hmm. The most important thing is to initiate the data sharing process, right? And the means by which the data sharing is done can improve over time, right? We spoke about the maturity model that at the lowest end, you can start with an ETL process. Believe you me, if in many countries right now, including in South Africa where I'm based, even though we have at the highest level of our maturity model automated systems where the data just flows and it's powered by workflow engines and powered by information mediators and other automation-driven platforms, we still have a lot of ETL-based data sharing. It's still prevalent everywhere, right? Because at the end of the day, what is of importance is that the data gets shared, right? How that data gets shared can be improved over time, but government entities and industry players need to start where they are, right? As long as they can adhere to the guidelines of the data sharing agreement and their scorecards are showing greens in the areas that matter, not reds, then that is acceptable, right? So over time, they can then build internal capacity to improve on the technologies that they're using to facilitate data sharing. One key point that our listeners need to understand is that data sharing is a necessary pain, right? Data sharing is a necessary pain. It has an element of disruption, right? Because it disrupts your day-to-day activities. And in many cases, almost in all cases, it's not one of the key activities of any organization, right? But if an organization is operating in a particular industry, it has a burden of sharing data. It comes with the terrain, right? So as a result, decision makers within organizations need to identify sustainable ways in which they can comply with data sharing requirements, data sharing agreements, with the resources that they have, as long as they can do it in a sustainable way, meeting the data sharing commitments. They can always improve and revise the technology over time.
Where can we find more about you?
Thanks, Emma. So I'm available on all social media platforms, my favorite being on LinkedIn. I'm be happy to share my LinkedIn profile and link so that the listeners can reach out to me.
Thank you all for listening. If you like what you heard, give us a review and let us know what you'd like to hear about our future shows and help other people find us. If you want to join the conversation, please find us on social media as Traceability Inside the Podcast and send us a message.